So we'll just give that a minute before we get started. And we're going to have a great turnout tonight. We had a lot of RSVPs, and I see those coming in now. So we are going to begin the recording of our program. And again, I want to welcome all of you to the Santa Barbara and Ventura Colleges of Law Debate Night. This is the third and final program in our series of debates on the California ballot propositions. My name is Dr. Matt Niemer. I'm the president of the Colleges of Law. It is my honor to welcome you tonight and to be your moderator for this evening's program. If you were with us last week, we had an outstanding program on Proposition 16. And then 2 weeks ago, it was an excellent program on Proposition 25. If you missed those, we have the recordings up on our social media feed, and you can check up with those at your leisure. This is a series that we started in 2016 when the Colleges of Law had a number of debate programs on propositions for that election cycle. We came back in 2018 for a proposition on rent control, and then we're back this year for three just terrific programs. And just with that, I want to just welcome all of our students and faculty and staff and alumni. We have some members of the press that we're expecting to be with us tonight as well. And I think it's going to be a great program. So how it will work is, before I go into the introductions, I'll give you a quick overview of how these debates work for us here at the Colleges of Law. We will have our introductions of our panelists tonight. They will each have 2 to 3 minutes of opening remarks. As your moderator, I'm going to be listening to the key points they make through their opening. We'll then have a moderated discussion for about 20 minutes. And then each panelist will have an opportunity to ask a question of each other. All along, I invite all of you as our audience and participants to think of questions that you would like to ask our panelists, and you can do so by using the Q&A feature on the Zoom webinar. And you'll see that as part of your Zoom panel of tools. So you can start asking your questions as soon as you like. And then we have Christopher. I'm going to bring you on the screen. Christopher Kane, our producer. Here he comes. Christopher Kane will be back at the back end of our debate, and will be moderating our questions and asking our panelists the questions directly from the Q&A. Say hi, Christopher.
Good evening, everyone, and welcome.
And I want to thank Christopher for his support of this program and all the behind-the-scenes work that he's doing on this. So, Christopher, you can jump off camera, and we'll bring you back in about a half hour. And so we have, like I said, a great panel tonight. I'm going to introduce, we'll start with the arguing yes on Proposition 22. We have with us David Cruz. David Cruz is the president of the League of United Latin American Citizens Council 3288. He, as you'll hear when he starts talking, he is a veteran of broadcast journalism. He's a commentator in a number of different outlets. You can see him on ABC, MSNBC, CNBC, NBC, iHeartMedia, and on and on and on. David Cruz, it's great to have you with us tonight. Thank you for joining us.
Thank you very much for the opportunity.
And arguing no on Proposition 22 is Rey Fuentes. He's a Skadden Fellow, a Partnership for Working Families. He's been active in local worker rights advocacy for many years. He's the editor-in-chief of the Berkeley Journal of Employment and Labor Law. He's a student director of the East Bay Worker Rights Clinic. His list of accomplishments goes on and on and on. Rey, it's great to have you with us tonight. Thank you for joining us.
Thank you so much for having me.
You know the format. So before we get into those opening remarks, I am going to open the poll. I'm going to start the poll now. It's going to have just 3 questions. And as the audience, we ask you to answer the poll. You can see it's live now. Are you in support of Proposition 22? Are you no, or are you undecided? And we're going to let those votes come in. And while I do so, I'm actually going to read directly, should all have received your ballot book in the mail, and I'm going to read just what's in the ballot book on, we'll give a little bit of background on Proposition 22 while we keep the poll open. As follows: exempts app-based transportation and delivery companies from providing employee benefits to certain drivers. 3 points. Point 1, classifies drivers for app-based transportation, rideshare, and delivery companies as, quote, independent contractors, not employees, unless company sets drivers' hours, requires acceptance of specific ride or delivery requests, or restricts working for other companies. Point 2, independent contractors are not covered by various state employment laws, including minimum wage, overtime, unemployment, insurance, and workers' compensation. Point 3, Instead, independent contractor drivers would be entitled to other compensation, including minimum earnings, healthcare subsidies, and vehicle insurance. Point 4, restricts certain local regulation of app-based drivers. And finally, point 5, criminalizes impersonation of drivers. And again, you can find that in your voter book. That is what's before the voters this fall. And we'll, on November the 3rd, we'll see the outcome of Proposition 22. And with that, I am going to give all of you just 10 more seconds to finish your poll, and then we're going to close the poll in 5, 4, 3, 2, 1, and it is locked. I won't share the results until the end of the debate, and we're going to re-poll all of you after our program completes. That, as has been the case with all of our debates, we start with the yes position. David Cruz, you have 2 to 3 minutes for opening remarks. The floor is yours.
Well, thank you. Thank you very much. And I want to thank all the app-based drivers who are out there, many of them this evening as you and I are here having this conversation. I am not a policy analyst. I'm not a policy wonk. I'm a guy who has been working in the community for a number of decades. And, you know, we have a saying in Spanish, no por sabio, pero por viejo. Not because I'm so wise, but because I've lived life and I've seen things. And when I saw what was going on with workers across California who are the drivers, and I was asking them what they wanted, and time and again, what I was hearing from them was that they wanted the opportunity to make as much money as they could with the best benefits that they could get under the given model, which means it is the job that they've chosen to do at this time. And truly, this pandemic has taken a toll on all of us in all walks of life. They're no exception. But I know colleagues of mine who are now not in the business that I'm in, but they're now driving vehicles to supplement their income. I know people who do talent work, who fill in some income with this kind of work. I know students who take off from semesters to earn money this way, single parents, and on and on and on and on. We also know that there are people who, because of immigration status, may not be doing other kinds of work, but they can do this kind of work. And so I wanted to know what was the feeling among these workers. And what I found is that the overwhelming majority of the drivers I spoke with and the ones that I have even contracted to take me to different places, they wanted to have that flexibility and the choice to decide for themselves what you want to decide for yourself each and every day. How do you use your time? You know, who's going to tell you how to work, when to work, why to work? And I also looked at another thing, the so-called supermajority in Sacramento of elected officials who believe that we didn't have a say in this process. So yes on 22 is my first opportunity along with these workers, and I stand with them tonight. I'm not against them. I stand with them, and they're overwhelming clamoring to say, we don't want somebody else in our business. We want to decide for ourselves how we work. And we don't want to talk about a minimum wage. We want to talk about a maximum wage. And that is guaranteed under Yes on 22, 120% over minimum wage. And that will vary across the state of California. So I'm here to have a conversation for you, the people who are out there listening, those of you who are going to decide what happens in California in coming days. And yes, you're going to hear we're at a crossroads. It's true. And the crossroads is, do we decide for ourselves how we wish to work, or do we want someone else who's motivated by another agenda and special interest to make that decision? Thank you.
Thank you, David Cruz. And over to you, Rey Fuentes, 2 to 3 minutes, arguing no on Proposition 22.
Thank you so much, and thank you for having me. And hello, David, again. It's nice to see you. I think
Hi, Ray.
I like to start these conversations really by talking about California law, and it's a law that applies to all employers here in California today. And I think many people who are listening today recognize that California has some of the strongest labor protections in the country for a very good reason. We have a strong minimum wage. It'll grow to $15 per hour tied to inflation. California enacted the first paid family leave law in the country that ensured that workers can access paid family leave when they have a new child or to take care of a family member. And we do this in California because we believe truly in protecting the dignity of people who work and so that they can do it safely. But the flip side is that it also protects consumers. Good labor protections protect everybody. Take paid sick leave, for example. I would love to know, and I feel like many people would love to know, that the people delivering essential services, food and medical supplies, have paid sick leave, for example, to take time off for work if they fall ill, and so that they don't spread illness to others. And so I think those are core baseline bedrock protections that I think we can all agree with. But 10 years ago, app-based companies like Uber, Lyft, and Instacart started operating in California, and their services are valuable. I believe that they should be able to exist, but I think they can do it by providing basic labor protections for their workers. And this is something they've avoided by calling their workers independent contractors. They've essentially elided all of this California protective law because, really for one principal reason, because it was cheaper to do so. And now these companies, Uber, Lyft, DoorDash, Instacart, and Postmates, have come together to spend $181 million on the most expensive ballot proposition in this country's history for one reason, and that is to roll back these worker protections because they feel like they're too onerous to follow. So Proposition 22, if you just look plainly at the text that is in your voter guide, it describes how this ballot proposition will not cover a true minimum wage because it doesn't pay workers for the time that they spend waiting for jobs, which could be about half the time for many of these workers. It doesn't provide paid family leave or disability insurance, no unemployment insurance protections, even during this COVID pandemic. No workers' compensation, no overtime protections, and the list goes on and on. And so this is why we think it's a dangerous proposition, because in the worst global pandemic this world has really ever seen, well, really for a century, we're not actually protecting workers when they need it the most. And so that's why a no vote on Proposition 22 is so important, because we can go back to having a democratic conversation. In fact, Proposition 22 is so dangerous, and why these companies are spending $181 million is because the proposition can never be changed. If voters pass Proposition 22, it will be impossible to amend by the state legislature or to send it back to the people. So that's why I think it's critical to look really critically at Proposition 22, and a no vote really is the only answer.
Thank you, Rey Fuentes, and for both of you and your opening remarks. Rey, I'm going to start with you on my first question. Yeah. I'd like to hear a little bit more. You made a point about consumer protection and the impact on consumer protection should Proposition 22 advance. We're going to get into a lot about worker protections tonight, but let's start with consumer protections. Can you say more? Can you create a future for us where the consumers are not protected in a way that looks different than today?
That's right. This is one reason why San Francisco, for example, passed the first paid sick leave law in the country, because they recognized that workers needed protection, but communities needed protection. And there's evidence that suggests that communicable diseases, like we're coming into a flu season and we're still dealing with the pandemic, paid sick leave is critical to ensure there's not community spread of diseases. But there's another subtle point. The wage guarantee, for example, in the ballot proposition that David mentioned, it really will only pay workers when they have a ride request or they're completing a job. So it's not going to pay them for the waiting time or any time in between a job. So we want workers to clean a vehicle, for example, after a passenger, but this wage guarantee will ensure there's no incentive, because a worker will never be paid, not for the time, not for the cleaning supplies, to actually sanitize a vehicle in between rides. And so we think that's a public safety issue, and people should understand that there will be no incentive to ensure that type of safety under Proposition 22.
Thank you, David Cruz. I invite you to respond to Rey's comments about consumer protection. Just build
well, thank you. No, thank you.
What would happen?
Here's what the drivers tell me, because I've asked them about PPE. I've asked them about their practices to make sure their vehicle is clean. I was concerned about that because I take Uber, I take Lyft when I travel, which is a lot less right now since February because of COVID-19. Here's what they tell me. When they get a fare, when they get someone who's going to need their service, they will pull over, and they're usually overlapping depending on where they work. Look, my good friend Rey mentioned San Francisco. You know, San Francisco is a 7 square mile city. It's a lot more concentrated. The rides may be very short, maybe not as profitable, but I live in Los Angeles. So someone going, let's say, from where I'm at tonight, which is in Ventura County, to LAX, that could be a a significant fare, maybe 50, 60, 70. I hear as much as $80 or $85 that someone is going to pay, or they'll go from here to Santa Ana. Here's what they'll tell me. They'll pull over, they'll disinfect their vehicle while they're already engaged. And so, and they're working more than one app. Some of them are doing Uber, they're doing Lyft, and they're doing also some of the other apps like DoorDash and Grubhub and things like that. My point is that they like the idea of being able to determine for themselves which fares they take and where they go. And let me tell you, they do look at the ratings. If you take Uber, you take Lyft, you need to know that they look at the rating of you as a customer. I happen to be a 5-star because I love to tip my drivers. I really do. I think they deserve every penny. And I would invite everyone who's been saying that yes on 22 is bad, be generous in the way that you compensate your driver. I think that is important. But I want to come back to that thing about protection for the consumer. By that definition that's been given just a moment ago, if you take Uber, you take Lyft, if you use any of these services, and I've got boxes within a few feet of my front door here where I'm seated, I guess you and I are exploiting people, aren't we? But the fact is that it's the market that has designed this model. If it changes, it's going to affect the pricing, it's going to affect the number of workers. And I'll conclude with this. You know, I'm here because I want to protect as many jobs as possible for as many of these drivers as possible. The so-called golden ticket that the author of AB5, Lorena Gonzalez, talks about, which is what would happen if Yes on 22 fails, some are going to possibly become workers. What's going to happen to the rest? That's the thing that's happened in California. When we talk about a carve out, it's only for some. The rest of us don't get that golden ticket. Yes on 22 will ensure that hundreds of thousands of drivers are going to continue to decide for themselves how they work, where they work, and how much they want to work. And that, to me, that's a gain, guaranteed under law by Yes on 22.
Mr. Fuentes, I'm going to give you plenty of time to respond to any and all of that you wish. But let me drill further into what Mr. Cruz said is, and I'll just build on a point about the reviews, a point about just capitalism. So, is it the best interest of drivers to keep a clean and sanitized vehicle, for instance? And if they don't, and if somebody they pick up comes into their automobile and has a bad experience, that individual will have the opportunity to give a bad review, which could impact their business. So there is seemingly an incentive there that wouldn't require regulation for drivers to maintain a spick and span automobile. I want you to speak to that, and then you can build on anything else that was brought up by Mr. Cruz.
Yeah, we hear this refrain from the yes side many times. The response is that the market will help ensure that there are protections, ensure that workers will have all of the wages that they need. The unfortunate part is that the market has failed. Recent surveys of rideshare, delivery, and transportation workers indicate that these workers are living precariously on the edge. 46% cannot handle a $400 emergency. 1/3 of drivers report sleeping in their cars. This is not a situation in which the market is operating efficiently to ensure that these workers are protected. And I think that's precisely why California law has these generous protections. But I call them generous because they're more generous than almost any other state in the country. But in fact, they're not a golden ticket, like David mentioned. Really, it's the baseline minimum guarantee that we're talking about. And these are the guarantees that Proposition 22 is attempting to roll back. And I think, the best we can know from some of the best and most recent analysis about the impacts that Proposition 22 would have on workers come from the researchers who actually studied this issue. I'm not an economist, but I trust the economists when they come to us and they say, would there really be no appreciable impact for these companies if they can actually design a system that works efficiently? And in fact, it's working inefficiently right now. The companies have every incentive to flood cities with more cars, more delivery drivers, and this is why they're able to artificially drive down prices for consumers, but that's bad for the worker on the back end. We have hundreds, thousands of workers who are idling their cars around Los Angeles, San Francisco, and every major city in California for no reason other than that the companies have no incentive and no responsibility to ensure that these workers are given efficient times, efficient routes, and baseline labor protections. And let's not forget, this is a conversation about democratic representation. Proposition 22 strips from the people, strips from the legislature, and strips from the local governments their ability to regulate these companies to ensure that workers remain protected in the future. If there's something we don't like about Proposition 22 once it's enacted, if we don't like the idea of this 120% minimum wage tied only to engaged time, if we don't like the idea that workers don't get paid sick leave, that will never change in the future. And I think that's a critical component of this conversation, because these companies wouldn't be spending $181 million simply because of recent changes to the law. It's because they've had a history and a pattern of law breaking in California that has not changed. And they're simply trying to write their business model into the law rather than complying with the law as it exists now.
Matt, I'd like to address something that's been mentioned twice, and it's really not accurate. Yes, on 22 does allow for voters to change the law. And let me explain how. There is a seventh, eighth feature in it. You know it and I know it, Ray. Because if you'll tell the viewers who are now with us that under the Constitution of California, initiatives that become statutes, laws in our state cannot be changed. We know that. But under Prop 22, a seventh, eighth vote will enable us to make changes and improvements to the law. This is an important item that's on the table, which is why we didn't want to make it easy for the wishes of the voters to be undone by elected officials in Sacramento. And since you've mentioned the word democratic a couple of times, there's no democracy in a supermajority that defines for the rest of us how we're going to control the environment for these drivers across California. Did anybody ask them what they wanted? Because we did. And the independent survey that we've taken shows 4-1. The drivers don't want to be employees. They understand the risks that some are going to lose their jobs. They understand the risks of what's going to happen. If prices in the marketplace go up, you and I, and many of us who are watching, will be using the rides far less because the service won't be affordable.
Well, if I can respond.
I'll let you answer that, Ray, but just you brought this up in your opening remarks. You addressed it in your last comments, this idea of once Proposition 22 is settled, if there's nowhere else to go with that. I'm going to allow you to make one more comment. We're going to move on from that after this. Just make one quick point, and then we're going to go to the worker side of the topic next.
I appreciate that, because it does need to be clarified. In fact, there are mechanisms for the state legislature to enact a change to a statutory initiative. If you look at Article 2, Section 10C of the California Constitution, it clearly indicates that a statutory initiative, just like Proposition 22, can be amended by the legislature if they submit it back to the people, unless there is an amendment provision in the proposition. And I know that's very technical, but what it means is the 7/8 amendment provision ensures that this proposition can never go back to the people. And that's what the companies don't want. They don't want the people to weigh in once they see what's in Proposition 22 and once they see the effect of Proposition 22. And the important point to note is that I've personally represented workers who've tried to get unemployment insurance during this pandemic. I've helped navigate these workers through crisis. And I honestly don't understand where a 4-1 margin comes from. I've read the survey. I know how that survey was conducted, but I've worked with thousands of drivers, training them to access unemployment insurance and personally represented them. And every single one of them recognized that it's not about employee status. It's about, at the end of the day, what benefits and protections of California law are extended to these workers. And under Proposition 22, none of them will be.
It's time. There couldn't be a better segue. We're going to now move on to workers. We'll close out. And if the audience wants to bring that topic back in, we'll re-engage it there. But Mr. Cruz, you raised some interesting statistics of some work that's been done to canvas drivers. I invite you now to go further into that. You mentioned where did you get this data? Where is it published? Can you share more? So we wanted to get a baseline of some of the facts that you're presenting here to make your point.
Sure. Well, there's a couple of things I want to bring to the conversation. The independent rideshare study that was conducted in May of 2020 indicates and shows that the drivers we spoke with on a 4-1 basis across the state of California, admittedly, there are pockets of California that are quite unique. I acknowledged one of them. San Francisco is, to me, an anomaly. It is a very small footprint. It is tough to service that. area for this reason. It is difficult to find places for drivers to park, so they're continuously driving. They cite that among one of their greatest sources of expenses. We see that can skew their income. But at the same time, if we're just using the common sense, a company cannot simply say, turn on your app, and from the time you turn it on till the time you turn it off, you're now my responsibility. And here's why, Matt. Here's why this doesn't work. If they're turning on more than one app, then who are they working for? The fact is, they're working for themselves, as I do when I take on multiple projects. We call it multitasking. That's exactly what the drivers are doing. And the other thing that I want to bring up is the UC Riverside study that was done by a non-labor center, unlike the one at Berkeley, which will be cited, I'm sure, in this conversation. The UC Riverside study demonstrated that drivers on average across the state of California who do at least 5 hours a week are going to average $25.61 an hour, and that's taking into account time when they're not engaged and after expenses. Plus, it does not include the commissions that they can still continue to earn. And I would urge people to always consider we have a say in those decisions too by how we treat the drivers. We ought to be generous with them. Thank you.
I'm going to go to you next, Mr. Fuentes, and really let's use some time here. I'll invite you can build on this, but just there's a lot of people on with us tonight. There's going to be a lot that are going to watching this after the fact. We're getting into the what do drivers think topic. So Mr. Cruz has said the drivers think this. I invite you to say, I think the drivers think this, and then build your argument through anecdotes, facts, whatever you'd like to use.
Sure. Yeah, David mentioned, the driver, this independent survey of drivers, and it actually comes from a blog, the Rideshare Guy. He has a list of about 80,000 drivers who respond, affirmatively to his blog, and he surveyed them and he asked them whether or not they wanted to be independent drivers or employees. Well, in fact, that kind of double-barreled questioning doesn't lead to an insightful answer, and it was a closed survey of about 700 drivers who don't represent the driver community. In fact, 80% of the drivers who responded to the survey represent that they're white. Yet a similar amount from an independent study by UC Santa Cruz indicates that 80% of workers for these companies are workers of color. 56% are immigrants. And we recognize that these workers will be the ones left out in the cold, and they're not representative of this issue. I've worked with several organizations throughout the state, Gig Workers Rising, Rideshare Drivers United. There are a number of organized groups of drivers who are coming together to recognize that they've not been given a fair shake. They've not been given the types of protections that all workers in California deserve, but particularly these workers, because they've been left out of the cold because they've been forcibly misclassified by their employer. And now they lack so many of these protections, particularly during the pandemic. And I think this is a critical point. These workers have been cut off from the unemployment insurance system. And in fact, Uber, for example, has said they've advocated for the state not to advertise unemployment insurance to these workers, even though right now workers are starting to convince the state that, yeah, the law has changed and these benefits should be extended to drivers. And I think the companies have made a lot of hay around the idea that they might have to change their business model to follow the law. Well, Uber has represented to its shareholders that it's sitting on $6 billion, billion with a B, dollars in cash reserves that they could be using today to expand worker protections. In fact, the $50 million that they're putting into this ballot proposition, along with the roughly 50 million more that Lyft is putting in, would fund 800,000 days of paid sick leave for drivers. And so in the very same breath that they're saying we want to expand worker rights, they're doing the opposite by taking them away through Proposition 22.
I'm going to go to Mr. Cruz next, but just one more back to Mr. Fuentes. You have cited a number of these organized groups that you work with.
That's right.
Have they been canvassed? Are they all in, I would say, against Proposition 22 in an organized way? Well,
those workers, I don't know of any independent surveys that have reached out to those driver groups independently, but the UC Santa Cruz study actually indicates that 63% of workers hope that the state will enforce worker protections that extend these types of benefits to workers. Because again, it's not about employee or independent contractor status. At the end of the day, these workers want to know that they're being paid fairly, doing the work with dignity, and that they're protected when inevitably something will go wrong. they get sick, they get into a car accident, but Proposition 22 will leave them in many significant ways unprotected, or the protections that they do offer pale in comparison to what California law would offer. You know, and David mentioned a couple of studies like the Riverside study. I think, you know, that has been debunked by researchers who have actually really gone into the detail of the study. For example, they don't even use the current minimum wage when they're making this calculation. And I think David would also agree that they're not offering through Proposition 22 a maximum wage of about $26 an hour. They're not ensuring that workers get that amount. They could get that amount. What the UC Berkeley and the UC Riverside studies don't have in common is that the UC Berkeley study, which said that drivers would be guaranteed $5.64 an hour, comes from the fact that they're not getting paid for all of these relevant expenses that workers are putting in and never seeing a cent from. And so that's the important point that these studies are trying to suss out. What are the companies actually obligated to provide? And that's why it's so important to actually look at the data, but then also just look at the law and see how it's not covering workers.
My notes are so copious, just trying to keep up with you. You know, go ahead, Matt.
Time to respond, but first, I'm curious. Do you and you've talked to a lot of these drivers, Mr. Cruz, and it sounds like you have a lot of anecdotal information and other sources to draw from. But do you yield Mr. Fuentes' point that the drivers want more than what they currently have? They may want benefits and protections that are currently not in place.
And this is why I think we ought to engage with these companies, but not in an adversarial way. You see, under the model of AB5, we look at big business. We look at business as the boogeyman. They're somehow the enemy. Let me tell you the way I work with businesses, because I am in that space of advancing business development and the economy and jobs in my community. I don't want to put Mr. Rey Fuentes on the spot, but I would ask anyone, have you ever started a business? Do you know what risk entails? And you know, when you fail, as I have, on at least 3 ventures, there's nobody there who's standing next to you saying, hey, you ought to do it again, and you ought to do it again, and you ought to do it again. But you know what? You keep doing it because you believe somehow you're going to succeed. These drivers are after maximizing their hours, their opportunity to work. They don't want the short rides. But you see, if somebody doesn't want to go beyond the footprint of San Francisco, and I keep citing that because it's an anomaly, they may not get the longer rides. They may not get the more profitable rides. I know that because I've learned it from the drivers. They pick and choose the routes that they take. They pick and choose the hours that they take. If they become workers, those who are lucky enough to get, and it wasn't my term, I want to make it clear, that term golden ticket came from the assembly member, Lorena Gonzalez herself, who told me we are after the golden ticket. The question is for whom? And you see, these drivers are telling me, if we start as workers from day one, then we're going to be told when to work, where to work, and how long to work. And the reality is this. My good friend Ray mentions that there are no guarantees under 22. The fact is that AB5 doesn't give you a guarantee. We don't know how many workers will remain. We don't know what they're going to get paid other than minimum wage. And I'll tell you what, I would rather, in this free marketplace of mine, in this changing gig economy, I think I can do better at 120% above minimum wage as the floor, and then it's up from there, including commissions. And I'm going to pick the best customers that I can pick and the best days and the best hours, because that's what I can do here. And there's not going to be anybody behind me telling me when to work, and there's not going to be some special interest dipping their hand into my pocket because now I'm a member of their group. And that's really what this is about here. It's not about the workers, the drivers themselves. It's who's going to control that group of workers and who's going to profit. They're just a commodity. And that's what I resent.
A lot to work with there. I'm going to go to Mr. Fuentes next, but just want to go back to a point you made, David Cruz, and that is, it sounds like you yield the point that many workers in the gig economy want more than what they currently have. They want protections. They want some additional benefits and beyond. Is your case then to go to the individual companies themselves and advocate in a way for that to happen? Isn't that
my case is to pass 22 past 22 because it does have improved conditions for workers, and continue to work with these companies because I want more than that, Matt. Let me tell you, in addition to those benefits today, I want them to invest into the education of our children in California. I want to see opportunities for these next generations to become not the drivers, but the designers of these companies, and the guys who are really the men and women who are going to determine the future of these companies. That's why I said what I said.
Thank you. Mr. Fuentes, I'm sure you have a page full of notes on this. Before I send it over to you, and I'll give you minutes plus if you want to respond, going to go to the audience in a few minutes. So just think of your questions. You can build on any of the points that we made. There's a lot we haven't covered yet. We can talk about that. So we're going to have the audience segment coming up soon. But Mr. Fuentes, over to you.
Yeah. So David makes a big point about these workers potentially being, entrepreneurs, that they have their own business, that they get to choose their customers. And this couldn't be further from the truth. I've worked with a number of drivers. Sherry Murphy is a driver who works and drives in the Bay Area. We have several workers outside of the Bay Area, along with workers in San Diego, in LA, workers that do this work and have represented the fact that the companies can choose on a whim to deactivate them. That has nothing to do with geography, unfortunately. The drivers really are at the whim of these companies. And the other point, that they invest a significant amount of their time, that's true. But really the rest of the operation is controlled by the companies. They don't get to choose their workforce. They don't get to set the price. They don't get to decide what's profitable or what's not profitable. They really are just dispatched a ride or a delivery. And when they finish the job, they're left holding the rest of the account. They've used up all of their money. The money that should be going back to them is money spent on fuel, money spent on phone plans, on cleaning equipment. And the critical part is that they do this all, again, during a raging global pandemic. We're seeing record level, spikes across the country, and they could be coming to California next. And these workers don't get provided PPE. For example, Lyft has been providing PPE and options for workers to purchase masks rather than providing them for free, which is what is an obligation, a current obligation of the law. And so I think these are the critical points, that these workers are left without these protections, but they're not truly independent businesses, because if they were, they'd be holding themselves out as businesses, advertising, using business cards, actually building a client list. You do none of that when you work for these applications. And we have drivers all over the state who have really recognized that this is really not the type of driving gig for them.
We're going to have a lot more to discuss here, but this is the time of the debate. I'm going to go to you first, Mr. Cruz, where we have an opportunity for each of you to ask a question, do a little fun cross-examination. And so we can go back on any of the topics, so you can take on some that's already been made, but over to you, Mr. Cruz, a question to Mr. Fuentes.
Ray, may I ask you this? And I jotted this last point down.
Yeah.
Yeah, I agree with you that safety for the workers is super important, because I don't want to get into a dirty vehicle myself. And I hesitated to use Uber and Lyft recently because I had to travel and I was concerned about that very point, which is why I asked, how do you keep your car disinfected? If that is so important to you and others who are Nixine 22 and who want to keep AB5, and you cited the state of California, then why hasn't the state of California mandated and provided for PPE for all workers across the state? Why do they let farm workers? Why do they let these workers? Why do they let meat packers? Look, in every walk of life, Ray, why are we as consumers not dogging our people in Sacramento, forcing them to exact from the supermajority legislature right now? They have the power to do it, but they haven't. Why don't they provide the safety mechanisms for all the workers of California? Don't we all deserve it? That's my question for you.
I appreciate that. I think the answer to that truly is that the law already exists. I think it's an unfortunate component of the conversation, both with these companies and through the Yes campaigns, advertising it, that there's some form of amnesia, as if the law doesn't currently apply to these companies and doesn't currently cover these workers, when in fact it does. The current law requires that these workers put in place safety plans to ensure that drivers remain safe in their vehicles, because we know driving for these companies is one of the most dangerous things you can do, getting into car accidents or potentially being exposed to a communicable virus like COVID-19. So the law currently requires that these protections be extended to workers. It's the companies that have decided, well, they'd rather not comply because it's too expensive. And so I think the important component is recognizing the law as it exists now, but that it's all not about AB5. It's not about recent changes to the law. These companies have been sued by their workers across the country, around the world, since their inception, because they've decided, contrary to every conceivable employment law test, that these workers are independent contractors, when in fact they are not. They don't operate as independent businesses. And so what we're saying is our baseline labor protections, like PPE protections, should be extended to these workers.
Well, maybe I didn't make my question clear, Matt. I wasn't asking whether it was a law requirement. I was asking, why aren't the lawmakers ensuring that the state provide that to the workforce of California, not to govern with laws that can be passed down and become a cost to the business or the employee? Why don't they provide it like other states have done so for their workforce?
30 seconds.
Yeah, I think that is a question for the legislature. I think the governor has taken steps to ensure that, under his executive order, for example, that paid sick leave gets extended to workers. But that's a benefit that the companies are going to be required to offer to these workers, because this is a time when workers need these protections. But I think it is a question for the legislature, but it's one, I think, unfortunately, to go back to this topic around Proposition 22, the legislature will never get to decide again if Proposition 22 gets passed. So I would hope that we all have this conversation now and that we can continue having it in the future, because Proposition 22 just closes the book.
Thank you. And Ms. Fuentes, your question for Mr. Cruz.
Yeah, I think on the same conversation around, safety for workers, we want to ensure that workers do have safety on the job. And so I just want to ask, why don't you think that the companies, I know you didn't draft Proposition 22 and, I'm not working for the other side, and we're just interested parties, but I think on this point, why do you think there aren't paid sick leave protections? I mean, paid sick leave is a basic protection that, California has pioneered on. Why don't we extend that very basic protection to workers?
Well, I don't think it's an either or. You see, I don't believe that it's an either or. I don't go out from my house every day and think every business is a bad business because they are a business. And by the way, if they're profitable, they're going to be a very bad business. Here's what I do believe. I decide how I use my time when I work. I try to make as much as I can. And from what I make, I have overhead. I have things that I have to pay. And then what I do is I go to somebody to help me fill out my taxes. And we're talking about people who do pay taxes, and we should be helping educate them and make them aware of how you take these expenses and you write them off. And that's not a foolish thing to do. So we as volunteers, we do that in our community. We've been doing it for years. We try to help the small business worker and the business owner. Most of them are mom and pop businesses, and most of them are started by people of color in California, the fastest growing sector being women of color. And so we teach them and we get them help. See, to me, it's not about big government deciding what I'm going to do with my time. It's about me deciding it. And I want every worker to have that chance for him or herself. But most of us don't have that knowledge. So what I try to focus on is how to take that knowledge and turn it into profit for these individuals. And that's what I do.
Have
That's what
you
I do.
extended paid sick leave to your employees?
Well, right now I work as a consultant. So when I hire someone, I pay them more than minimum wage. I'm paying people $75 to $100 an hour to write for me. Not because I couldn't get them for less, but because I know that a third of that is going to the legislature up there in Sacramento. The people who are making these laws, they're the ones who command these huge numbers of business. And I work the first 10 days out of every month for lawmakers who don't live under the laws that I have to work under. And that, Ray, is why I decided to get involved. This is the first time that I've really gotten involved this close to something that is this important. Because when my father started his barber shop, somebody came to him and wanted him to work according to their pay scale and their hours. And he said no. and they firebombed his barbershop, and he nearly died because of that. And I was a kid then, but I never forgot. You know what? Labor shouldn't be doing that with the people of California. We should be allowing people to decide for themselves how to work and for whom they wish to work. I think, you know what? They're smart enough to figure it out. Let me tell you, they know how to do it. They know how to do it. Don't underestimate us.
Thank you, Mr. Cruz. And that will close the moderated portion of our program tonight. And we're going to move next to the audience Q&A. Christopher Kane, I'm going to bring you back on the camera. Christopher's back with us. We have some questions coming in from the audience. I'm going to send it over to you. What's our first question from the audience?
Good evening, Dr. Niemer, and thank you. The first question is interesting. It's been coming up several times amongst the audience in different versions. It's basically a question of the market versus public policy. I will start with Mr. Fuentes. What about Mr. Cruz's earlier assertion that the market ought to be the judge and that the market is the force that indeed gave rise to the modern system of vehicles and rides for hire? Ought that sanctity of the market not be protected?
Yeah, I think we do have a conversation where people have mentioned, that the market should decide who gets good jobs and who gets what protections. And I think, unfortunately, it misses the fundamental point when it comes to this issue is that rules and regulations designed by government is what allows markets to work efficiently. Markets are not efficient when you flood the city of Los Angeles with thousands of additional cars, pump all of the pollutants from the cars into the air, and then ensure that those workers at the end of the day don't receive enough money to go back home and feed their children. I don't think anybody believes that that's an efficient market. I think, David's mentioned several times that, this is just the San Francisco issue, but I've worked with other drivers, Jerome Gage, for example, who's engaged with Mobile Workers Alliance. He's mentioned specifically that the company has not provided him the ability to really provide for his own safety, for his own livelihood, and that's not an efficient market.
Okay. All right. Well, thank you. Well, David, the next question is then for you. It's the public policy side. What then about Mr. Fuentes' assertion that the market has also, it appears to have provided a significant number of jobs and income for people of color and for immigrants? Do we lose
And
that?
I welcome that. I think that's wonderful. I think we ought to applaud it. I'm all about a successful business. I'd rather work with a company that is strong, because in this pandemic, by golly, I can go out my door, turn on that app, and I'm going to be doing something. I may end up down at LAX if I can get that kind of a fare, but I want that company to be strong. And I want to be in something that cannot be outsourced. That's real important to me. This is a low barrier entry type of profession. But let's face it, the majority of these workers, many of them are doing more than one thing. They're not just doing this, Christopher. They're also, they may have other jobs, they may have other obligations, other duties. I don't know of any other job where I can start whenever I want. I'll go out there. And by the way, if I've got to come back because my child or my spouse is sick, I'm going to be able to do that. I want that kind of flexibility. And I think that's the world we live in now. This is the real world out here. This is not the world made up by lawmakers in Sacramento. We all have to figure it out.
Thank you. All right. The next question, I would just ask that each of you be brief in the interest of time, is really a bigger one. There's a variety of questions from our audience regarding vision. If one considers, let's say, the phrase, the California that we all want to live in, would voters be closer to that California that we all want to live in if they were to agree with each of your respective positions? Having gone to Mr. Fuentes first, let's go to Mr. Cruz this time first.
I know what's going on in California as far as companies leaving the state. There's a reason why businesses are leaving the state. There's a reason why people are leaving California. This used to be the state. I came out here 25 years ago because I wanted to come out here for a greater opportunity. And by golly, I got it. My kids grew up here and we're okay. But let me say something to you. Over-regulation of businesses, including killing jobs, doesn't help the workers of the state. We need to find a way to work with businesses and create partnerships and alliances that make the win-win truly work for both and make it stronger. That's what I believe in. I don't see business as my enemy. I see them as someone that I need to sit with and discuss what's going to be best for them and for me.
Okay. All right. Mr. Fuentes.
Yeah. And so I think when we look at a vision of California, it's one where every worker can do their work with dignity and protection. And, California has had some of the most progressive labor laws in the country, yet it's also recorded some of the greatest economic growth in the world. If California were alone, its own country, it'd be the fifth richest country in the world. And that's with everything David has described about onerous regulation. And I think Proposition 22 does the reverse of that. It actually ends the conversation. Really, there will be no conversation after Proposition 22. And I think this is something that David has alighted throughout this conversation, that it's missed an opportunity to really have a conversation. We have a legislature, we have elected leaders, so we can continue to iterate, so we can create better law. Proposition 22 ends that conversation with worse law than what we start with.
I'm going to jump in here, just a housekeeping matter. We want to make sure we have time for the closing remarks. So Christopher, maybe one, maybe two more, we can get them in fast.
We just have one quick question, and it's informational. There seems to be some confusion amongst our attendees.
Yeah.
They're just curious of both individuals regarding income and cost. Is there a way to predict exactly how much a driver's hourly wage would be with a yes or a no vote? And is that indeed what it ought to be?
Yeah, so the Legislative Analyst's Office indicates that drivers for ride hail and food delivery companies make between $11 and $16 per an hour. This is not competing academic studies. This is the nonpartisan Legislative Analyst's Office that really analyzes ballot propositions. And their evidence shows that there's a significant share of workers who are making less than minimum wage. Right now, I think it's difficult with the market dynamics to understand exactly what a worker is going to get at any point in time. And, Proposition 22 says that as much, because it doesn't actually provide for some magical maximum wage, because you can earn a maximum wage under current law. I think the point here is what's going to be guaranteed to workers so that they have a floor and they know what they're going to get.
Okay, Mr. Cruz?
Well, my answer to that is this: AB 5 guarantees minimum wage. If we pass 22, I'm
No.
going to tell you what I've seen. It's 120% of minimum wage plus commissions. I want that. Here's the other thing. If you kill 22, you're going to kill jobs all across the state of California, because companies aren't going to hire them en masse. This idea that everyone's going to get a job after this, that's truly a misrepresentation. And I think it's a false hope. I'd rather take my chances in this market and do the best I can with my God-given talent and ability and find my way forward. And again, I say it's going to be working with the companies, not against them.
All right. Well, quickly to that effect, we're talking about worker protection laws. Hasn't every worker protection law basically been opposed based on concerns of the market?
I think that's precisely the point. We've had, the California Chamber of Commerce every year calls these job protection bills, job killers, and threatens that there'll be job losses, that companies will escape California, when in fact they learn to work with it. And what they find out, this was true of paid sick leave, this was true of paid family leave. When you institute these policies, workers are better off, they're more productive, they actually bring more to the bottom line. And I don't think we're working against companies. It's Proposition 22 working against the people and democracy itself. There will not be a voice after this proposition. And I think David, again, has alighted that point that somehow it's a solution when in fact it's a closed book.
So we ordered a pizza on Friday of last weekend, and my wife said, "Do I tip 7 or do I tip 11?" I said, "Well, what do you want to tip?" She says, "Well, I've got 7, but if it's going to start costing me 11, I'm going to go pick it up." Look, guys, at some point, we all make a decision. How much can we pay? I don't want that to happen with Uber, Lyft, and all these services. I have neighbors in their 70s. They get their meds delivered this way. I want these services to be here. And I have nothing against the Bay Area. You used to live up there. It's too expensive. But I would tell you, I care about service throughout the state of California, Christopher. Thank you.
All right. Well, I would actually thank both the participants. That will close the audience participation section, and I will turn it back over to our moderator, Dr. Niemer.
Thank you, Christopher, and thank you to all the members of our audience who submitted their questions. Apologize for those that didn't have time to get your questions in. And so we're going to turn to our final segment of our program, and that's closing remarks, and we'll have a little bit of time at the end for the final poll. So all the audience members, stay through to the end. You're going to want to see how this plays out. So we're going to start with Mr. Cruz. You have 1 to 2 minutes for closing remarks.
Well, first, I want to thank you, Ray, for being here this evening and for being a gentleman. I tell you what, I've been on some conversations that have been rough, guys. I had to ask myself, am I really interested in continuing to do this, but here's why I do it. I live in a community of kids who go to a high school where my wife teaches. They're the sons and daughters of immigrants, farm workers. And these kids, they're working in fast food jobs, and many of them are leaving my community because they can't find decent work. So what I do and what my wife does is we try to put them on a pipeline to college. And to do that, they still need to supplement their incomes because textbooks are so expensive and there's expenses out of pocket. So here's what I will tell you. I got involved in this because I'm tired of seeing these kids not have a place to work and they have to leave home to go find it. We shouldn't be penalized because I don't live in LA or San Francisco. I live here in the Central Coast and I love it. I want as many jobs to remain as possible in California. And by golly, I'm going to fight for the benefits for the greater number as much as I can. I may not get them all, but I'm going to try to get as much as I can. And I'm going to work with these companies. You can rest assured because that's what I do as a volunteer. And I'm going to continue doing that. And I just want to thank the drivers. If you're one of them, my respetos to you. You deserve to be commended, and thank you for what you do and the service that you provide. Stay safe out there. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Cruz. Rey Fuentes, your closing remarks.
Yeah. So I just want to also extend my thanks to everybody who's organized this debate and David for this great conversation. I hope it's illuminating to folks. I think, I hold the same vision, but unfortunately it goes in the opposite direction. I am a son of an immigrant. I'm a son that had been able to build an opportunity. But unfortunately for a lot of people, that's not going to be the case, particularly under Proposition 22. And we can talk about lots of different components of the economy, but Proposition 22 is narrowly tailored at essentially a gift to special interests within the community of people who run these app-based companies who have the money. They have the money right now to ensure that workers have these protections. But instead of saying, well, we're going to offer those protections, we're going to put that money into a ballot proposition to ensure that those protections never get to a single worker. And I don't think this is a situation where we're talking about oppressive regulation. Having 1 day of paid sick leave can be make or break for a lot of people who are living on the edge and work at these jobs for a subsistence living. And so I think that's the important point, that law-abiding businesses that want to come into California have found ways to make it work. And we have one of the greatest economies in the world for that reason. And so I don't think that Proposition 22 is the answer. And that's why I hope that everyone listening today, goes out, reads the ballot proposition, and understands why a no vote is so important.
And thank you, Mr. Fuentes. And now is the time. We're right on schedule. I'm going to bring the poll back up and we're going to relaunch the poll. And it's relaunched, should be back out in the field. Hopefully you're able to be able to make the poll. Well, I got a fail to launch polling error. Well, that's unfortunate.
We'll never know.
Let's go to commercial.
We have a Zoom glitch. And so here it comes. The poll is open. So Zoom caught up with us. So the poll is open. So all of you, here it comes. Here come the votes. And while the votes come in, just want to thank again our panelists for such a terrific discussion day. David Cruz, thank you for joining us.
It's an honor.
Rey Fuentes, thank you for being with us tonight.
Thank you so much.
Is such an emblematic of what great programs like this can be. I mean, debates are fun, they're engaging, they're about sharing information, different points of view. And I want to thank the audience for participating with us tonight. Thank you to Christopher Kane for your work on the program, Carmen Bowen, the IT team, the marketing team, and just the whole Colleges of Law team, students, faculty, staff, and our trustees who are with us tonight. I'm going to run this for another few seconds, and then I'm going to end the poll. We'll give it a full minute, so about 10 seconds to go. And we'll get 5, 4, 3, final results are coming in. Now I'm ending the polling. And so
do we have a drum roll?
Yeah, drum roll, Ray.
So remember, we polled the audience before the debate started, so let's have a look at that. I'll bring it up on the screen here. And you can see, hopefully can you all see this? You see it on the screen. So we have 16% at the beginning of the debate say yes. We had 32%, and look at that, undecided. Almost half of our debate participants, audience members, were undecided. So let's go back to our poll. And I'm getting the error message again. Hopefully it will work. Well, let me just do this. I'll bring it on the screen live so you can see it there. Hopefully that works. Can you see the poll results now? Is it sharing correctly? Can you see it on the screen?
Yep.
And there it is. We have 27% for a yes. That undecided went from 52% to 5%. And Rey Fuentes, you are our winner tonight, and by far the largest increase.
Congratulations, Ray.
You have won the poll. How do you feel?
It's been a great time, and I really hope, and I wish I could see everybody out there in the audience. Thank you for being here.
And with that, we're going to sign off. Thanks again for all of you for joining us. This is the third and final debate program here at the Colleges of Law. We're going to be back in 2022 with a new series of programs. Until then, appreciate all of you. Get out and vote, and we'll see you at the polls. Take care, everybody.
Good
Thanks
night.
so much.
Bye-bye.
Good night.